Hi, welcome to People Plus Places. My name is Linda Dishman, and I'm the president and CEO of the Los Angeles Conservancy. We started this series as a way to bring people together and share stories about important places throughout LA County. Today, we're going to be talking with Ken Bernstein, who wrote the recently published book, Preserving Los Angeles, which gives an excellent overview of the preservation program in the city of Los Angeles. And we'll be showing lots of images of buildings during the conversation. If you're interested in buying a book, there is information about that in the chat box. If you want an autographed book, you should use the link to Angel City Press. We will also list several bookstores that are legacy businesses. We will follow our conversation with a Q&A at around 12:45, so people should get their questions ready. And please use the QA button at the bottom of the Zoom screen to write your questions. We have a great crowd today, and there may be a few people who don't know Ken. So let me tell you a little bit about him. He directs the Office of Historic Resources and Urban Design Studio in the Planning Department for the City of Los Angeles. In a previous stint at City Hall, Ken served as the planning deputy for then council member Laura Chick. In between, Ken was the director of preservation issues for the Los Angeles Conservancy. You think I'd get the LA Conservancy right? For 8 years. I thought we'd start our conversation today by telling people how we met, because it included a threatened historic building. So the Conservancy was fighting to save the McKinley building, a 1927 fabulous Churrigueresque building on the corner of Western and Wiltern. And the property owner didn't want to save it. The city council member didn't want to encourage the property owner to save it. And it was basically being demolition by neglect. And so the Conservancy reached out to different council offices to try and find support, and did find support in council member Chick's office with her planning deputy, Ken Bernstein. So Ken, what do you remember about that?
Well, thanks, Linda. First of all, it's great to be with you and to be with the Conservancy today. Yeah, I do remember, I was primed to be favorable toward preservation. I'd been on a lot of Conservancy downtown walking tours and Last Remaining Seats film series events on Broadway. So while I was a planning generalist in those years, I was friendly toward preservation. And I somehow convinced my boss, Laura Chick, to break that unwritten rule of the city council and take on the member of the district on a land use issue, which was very rare, although she was a kind of someone who spoke her mind on the city council, and in terms of personality, was primed to do that as well. Unfortunately, we came up a little short. We got some support from also then Councilman Mike Fewer, who's now our city attorney, and some others. In the process, I learned how to pronounce the word Churrigueresque, the architectural style of the building, learned what that was, and learned a bit about preservation. But unfortunately, this effort came up a little bit short. We didn't have quite enough votes to get it designated as a city historic cultural monument, so it was demolished. A Save-On drugstore, now CVS, was built. This is right across from the Wiltern Theater and the Wilshire Western Metro Rail station. So it was a real missed opportunity to reuse a remarkable historic building.
And we even had two different people that wanted to buy it. They had very viable bids, and the owner refused to do that. Instead, to build this drugstore. So it was a very sad moment, and but it was good in the fact that I met you. And we were able to work together, and then work together a lot for 8 years at your time at the LA Conservancy.
Yeah,
so,
and
go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, and then you taught me along the way everything I needed to know about historic preservation. I came into the Conservancy by no means a historic preservation expert. So I often credit you, and I'll do it here, for my graduate tutorial in historic preservation. Linda sat me down every, some free Friday afternoons that we had to let everybody know. And you really taught me the nuts and bolts of preservation, from the Secretary of the Interior standards to Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation. I knew none of that coming in, so thank you.
Well, you're very welcome, and no doubt the hardest thing was actually to learn how to pronounce Churrigueresque.
Right.
So Section 106 was a lot easier than that. But we did have some good projects, and we're going to talk about a few of those today. And I will say that, while you certainly learned a lot about preservation, you brought a lot of planning knowledge and relationships at City Hall that really helped the Conservancy. So it was very much a partnership. So thank you. So let me ask you the first softball question. Why did you want to write this book?
Thanks. That's a great question. Give me a chance to talk about the book a little bit. A lot of my motivation to write the book really came from my frequent frustrations about how Los Angeles and how historic preservation are depicted. That there's this saying often that Los Angeles is a city that doesn't care about its history, doesn't care about its historic buildings, and that there aren't people here in Los Angeles who want to be devoted to preserving the city. And I think the Conservancy kind of explodes that myth every day. And having grown to become the largest local preservation organization in the country in terms of membership. But there's still that misperception. There's also still a lot of misperceptions about historic preservation itself, that it's viewed as being kind of backward looking or about nostalgia or about stopping change, blocking progress. And, I've seen a very different Los Angeles, seen a very different role for preservation from where I've sat, both at the Conservancy and with the city. I've had a bird's eye view of all that's happened in Los Angeles with preservation and really wanted to tell that preservation story, that Los Angeles, far from blocking change or stopping progress, really has been a positive engine, one of the primary engines for positive change around the city, whether it's revitalizing downtown, such as here, Broadway, and the downtown historic core, economic revitalization of many of our communities, preserving neighborhoods, and so much more. And I wanted to kind of show Angelenos and those outside Los Angeles who misperceive the city, kind of the real Los Angeles, and show them the city that I've come to know and the rich historic resources, historic neighborhoods, and remarkable places that we've been devoted to preserving and revitalizing in the city.
Well, and all of that you said is absolutely captured in the book, and the photographs are amazing. But I think it's a great persuasive argument for historic preservation. So thank you for that. It's interesting, Los Angeles has a very early ordinance compared to other cities, and which surprises people that we have that. And it's not necessarily the strongest ordinance because it doesn't ultimately prevent demolition, but such as the case of Lytton Savings, which is being demolished right now. But it is a powerful tool, and the book talks about a couple of these different examples, and the first one, in my mind, probably the most important one is St. Vibiana, which demolition was started without going through the Cultural Heritage Commission, without pulling a permit. And the Conservancy was really forced into filing a lawsuit on a Saturday afternoon. And ultimately the court upheld the ordinance, which was the first time the ordinance had really been tested, and said that the city had to follow its ordinance. And it couldn't just let demolition occur of a designated historic cultural monument. And that was really the first time that we knew that it would withstand a court challenge, and ultimately saved the building. So we are very fortunate to have an ordinance like that. Sometimes it's more persuasive, and I know that your work on Chase Knowles was one of those examples.
Yeah, and I came in, like you said, I was at the very tail end of the St. Vibiana story, and really just involved as the Conservancy worked to ultimately adaptively reuse that as a event center. Vibiana, Tom Gilmore stepping in and adaptively reusing that. But I was part of the Conservancy effort to advocate for Chase Knowles Garden Apartments in Sherman Oaks, which was a really heated preservation battle. And Chase Knowles is one of the preeminent examples of what's often called kind of the garden city movement of planning and design, where the pedestrian is separated from the automobile. You have these large open spaces and really a sense of community that develops in sites like this based on the site design and both very shared and semi-private open spaces that exist. There's about 260 units. And in 2000, an effort began by a new owner to evict all the tenants and to demolish this for a new condominium complex. And we were approached some of the tenants who initiated really historic cultural monument, local landmark designation. And it was one of those advocacy issues. It was so heated. There was tremendous opposition from the property owner. They hired a team of lobbyists and community relations consultants to make the case against it. And Conservancy was advocating in city council. It was one of the few times in my career where the result really was hanging in the balance, and we did not know how it was going to go on the council floor as they were voting, whether we had enough votes, and barely we did. That led to the property owner turning around, agreeing to preserve the building, apply for our preservation incentive in the city, a Mills Act historical property contract, a property tax incentive program. But it speaks to the power of designation to save historic sites, but also here, the impact of historic designation on housing and kind of naturally occurring affordable housing. In LA, pre-1978 buildings are covered by our rent stabilization ordinance and are at a more affordable rent. So this designation preserved housing affordability and really preserved a close-knit residential community that you can sense when you step on the Chase Knowles property. You can feel that kind of social interaction and a sense of cohesiveness on that site.
Right, we've seen that in really all of the garden apartment complexes that we've worked with, from Lincoln Place to Wyvenwood, and it is one of the characteristics that defines them all. I love how once it was designated, the property owner decided to maybe change the strategy. It's interesting, when Century Plaza Hotel was threatened, it just took the city councilman saying that if we didn't find, or the developer didn't find a preservation solution, that he would designate the building, that brought the developer to the table, and we ultimately had an agreement that saved the hotel, and then allowed lots of new development behind it. And so it's interesting that sometimes you don't even have to designate a building to get people to come to the table, although ultimately the Century Plaza Hotel was designated and is a historic cultural monument now.
Yeah, and this shows, as you can see in the photo, the two high rises going up behind it, and the hotel itself is soon to reopen as we come out of this COVID period. That the win-win solution here really did accommodate some substantial new density on the site while still preserving the hotel. And there's a number of examples like this in the book of how historic designation has led to these transformations, preserved historic places. I think one thing is each of the sites we've just cited here had an important role for the LA Conservancy. And the book is not a kind of a chronicle, institutional history of the Conservancy by any means, but I think it's really fair to say that but for the Conservancy, this book wouldn't have existed. I mean, the accomplishments that are showcased, Los Angeles as a potential model for other cities in historic preservation, was really only made possible by the collective efforts of the preservation community, really led by the Conservancy.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And it's lots of grassroots people
Yeah.
working way beyond the Conservancy, which we are grateful for every single day, because we can't do it alone. But it does really speak to partnership, which is so critical. And part of the People Plus Places is really bringing people together for saving places. So it's a nice linkage there. One of the things that has really come because of COVID, you mentioned COVID because of the hotel, as our legacy businesses have really suffered. And do you want to talk just a little bit about a couple of them that are featured in the book?
Yeah, we did identify a number of significant businesses through Survey LA, our citywide survey of historic resources. I think we'll come back to the survey and talk about that a little bit. But our legacy businesses really are anchors for so many of our communities, that those longtime businesses are the places that people identify with as really, kind of the places that define local communities. And a couple of the ones that we did feature, one of them is Pan's, which is in the kind of Westchester community near LAX on La Tijera, continuously operated for more than 6 decades by the same family. 1957 is when it opened, and great example of Googie style kind of coffee shop modernism. And I have to maybe just digress for a moment and just take in this photo, which is such a beautiful photo taken by my collaborator on the project, Stephen Schaefer, who most in the preservation community know as Schaef. Schaef is a preservationist himself. He's a board member of the California Preservation Foundation, active in preservation in his own community in Ventura. And he took this shot on the day before the COVID stay-at-home orders came down last March, and got one last photo shoot in and captured Pan's so beautifully. And he shot over 60, I think, let's see, I'm trying to remember the number. I think I'm sorry, 19,000 photos, I believe is what he said he took for the book, that got distilled down to a little over 300 original images, color images from all across the city. So I have to tip my hat to Shay for all of his work. And this photo really captures some of that. And then another legacy business is this is one of a handful of remaining Japanese American nurseries in the Sawtell community. And it really reflects, again, the cultural diversity of the city, that the Japanese American heritage of Los Angeles extends well beyond what many might think of just with Little Tokyo. You had this Western outpost in West Los Angeles, Sawtell, that once had 26 Japanese American nurseries prior to the Japanese American internment in World War II. And there are just a handful left. This is one of them, the Yamaguchi Bonsai Nursery from 1934. So, you know, the Conservancy has its legacy business program that I'm sure Linda will reference, but we're working toward creating a city legacy business program in partnership. Our Office of Historic Resources working with the Economic and Workforce Development Department, EWDD. There was a council motion asking us to look at creating a program like this, modeled after a similar program in San Francisco, to provide technical assistance, publicity, marketing, and potentially financial support to help bolster these anchors for our local communities.
Well, and that you raise a really good point of the city trying to respond to how to help these businesses, and certainly the Conservancy has been very involved in this. And I think, you know, the reason we have so much preservation success is that the city is engaged in many ways in preservation, particularly through your office, and obviously the Conservancy is. And before COVID hit, we had launched our legacy business program, which was mainly about promoting legacy businesses, which went into high gear with COVID. And we've now promoted over 100 legacy businesses on social media and have hit 1 million in views and reach on social media, which is really great. And we get some of the best comments on social media on our legacy business posts. So it is resonating within the community. And I think that this is one way that we bring more people into the preservation circle, because not everybody that cares about specific places in their neighborhood identify as a preservationist. But if this nursery were to stop operating, we would hear a lot of people that would be very upset about that. And we certainly found that with the recent announcement on the Cinerama Dome, which is also a historic cultural monument, that people depend upon their favorite building staying there, which is not always the case. So the legacy business program is very important. And we've been working closely with you, and I'm sure we will continue to do that. So part of the nursery was identified in Survey LA, which is a landmark for preservation in terms of how to survey a city, particularly a city as large and complex as Los Angeles. So I was able to serve on the review committee, which is actually one of the most fun things I have done in my time at the Conservancy, because I learned so much about the city. And, you know, one of the things that I was really excited to find out is that LA actually had a company town. And I, for some reason, love company towns. And it was called Goodyear Gardens, and it's in the Avalon and San Pedro neighborhood. And what I liked about it is that Goodyear built it, but they also did ones for their workers in Akron, Ohio, but they sold the houses to the workers and didn't keep them as renters. So it was a very forward-looking relationship between the company and the workers, which I thought was really fascinating. So Ken and I joked that we would each choose one of our favorites. And so that is my favorite. So Ken, what is your favorite?
Well, it's hard to choose one favorite, you know, out of like 30,000 properties or so that were identified in Survey LA. But so through the book, I chose really over 300 or so to showcase the breadth and range of what was identified in the survey. So some of those are significant for what they represent in the city, like Goodyear Gardens, the larger stories that tells about, that they tell about the social or cultural history of the city. And then some of them are just more kind of fun or architectural showstoppers. And I thought this is just more kind of more in the latter category, not that it's necessarily my favorite, but the boathouses of the Cahuenga Pass that were and are 12 identical single family homes from 1959. We discovered so many architects through Survey LA that weren't necessarily part of the architectural canon of Los Angeles previously, and this is one of those. And maybe some of you knew his name. I did not going in. Harry Gessner, who designed these homes, and he hired a team of Norwegian shipbuilders to assist with this construction, and used axes rather than saws to get sort of this wooden handcrafted look that he achieved. But Survey LA really was meant. It was a partnership between the city and the Getty Conservation Institute and the Getty Foundation that supported the project. And we literally surveyed every community in the city to went down every street of Los Angeles, looking at 880,000 parcels across the city. To identify significant historic places, and to use that, the mantra that I constantly repeat during Survey LA is that it really ultimately was a planning tool to know what and where our historic resources are, and that we can use that information to plan the future of the city. And that's really what Survey LA has been about. And I wanted to kind of capture the experience you had on the review committee and what many of us had going through the process, learning and exploring Los Angeles through this ongoing process of discovery through the survey, and kind of channel that into the book and share those experiences that really every community of Los Angeles has these special historic places, great architecture, but also places that define the essence of what those communities are.
Well, I think that's great because I did love it. And the other thing that I think is so striking about Survey LA is, first, it's a planning tool. But second is it helped identify how much of Los Angeles is really historic. And so often preservationists are chided with being, anti-growth, or, standing in the way of the future. And actually, if only 7% of the city parcels are historic, as identified either from Survey LA or already designated, that leaves 93% of the city left. So I think it's a good statistic for us to be using when we talk about how preservation really is not stopping all of these projects. So that for us was a very important part of the survey, as well as finding all these goodies.
Mhm.
So and you can read more of them in the book. The boathouses is a great segue to the recent past, and Survey LA was very instrumental in really going to 1980, which is unusual for the city in terms of doing survey work. So why don't you talk a little bit about some of the recent past finds?
Yeah, so we did it, and I think looking back, 1980 when we started Survey LA, it was 2006, and it was about a decade-long process through 2017 when we completed the last of the field surveys. And so it did seem very cutting edge to be looking back only 25, 30 years into the 1970s and taking in potential historic resources such as this one, which is the 2468 house in Venice. And it was from 1979, kind of a postmodern deconstructivist design. And it was a collaboration of Tom Main and Michael Rotundi, very early work of theirs. And they, of course, became very prominent architects in the subsequent decades. And it was called 2468 house because each of the facades had these windows in dimensions of 2 by 2, 4 by 4, 6 by 6, etc. But it kind of speaks to the continuing architectural legacy, Los Angeles, particularly in the Venice community, which had many prominent architects emerging in the 1970s. So that was one. We basically stopped the survey at 1980, but the survey teams did here and there pick up some exceptional examples from the 1980s that they just couldn't pass up noting as they were in those communities. And one of those was this house, the Stevens Harnell house, a great photo by Schaaf, our photographer, capturing the essence of what this is about. This was a architect, again, I was not familiar with, someone who was Portland-based, Robert Harvey Oschatz, and was from the 1980s, kind of late modern architecture with expressionist details. And I mean, I think it really speaks to all this kind of how in preservation time marches on. And now we're sitting in 2021, about 15 years after we started Survey LA, and really realizing that we also need to start taking stock of the architecture and as well as the, again, kind of the social history and the events, all the events and changes that took place in Los Angeles in the 1980s and 1990s.
Well, it's true, and it's sometimes it's hard for people to look at the recent past. When Century Plaza was threatened, there were two other threatened '60s buildings, so we had three threatened, and people just didn't get the '60s. And one of the reasons was that people saw them be constructed, and so the perception is that well, if I saw that being built, then it can't be historic because that would mean that I'm old. And so the Conservancy launched its '60s Turn 50 initiative, which was very successful. We only saved one out of the three threatened '60s buildings, but I think we changed a lot of people's minds about the '60s as part of that. And then we did this last year, the '70s Turn 50, and 50 is sort of the traditional demarcation of when something becomes historic. Although in the city of LA, we don't have to be bound by that with our historic cultural monument designation. But these educational efforts are really critical at getting people to think about things differently, and see that we need to preserve them now and not wait until they're 50 or 60 years old and see what's left. So, if you can imagine the image that we just saw, I mean, that is such a fantastic building. If it didn't make it, then how would you tell that story of this amazing architecture coming to Los Angeles from Portland?
No, exactly. And I think the Conservancy's advocacy around this, the education and awareness building that you and others have done, is paying dividends already. And we just saw last month the issuance of a new report from Mayor Garcetti and his chief design officer, Christopher Hawthorne, the Civic Memory Working Group, which I had a chance to be a participant, a member of that group, which made a number of recommendations about how we think about history and memory in Los Angeles, issues of memorialization and interpretation, but also some significant recommendations about historic preservation. And one of those in that report was recommending that we look at expanding Survey LA or somehow taking stock of architecture from the period 1980 through the year 2000, and really beginning to grapple with the most recent past. And again, not only architecture, but that was a period of rapid change, immigration, the 1992 unrest. So much happened during that time period, and how we think about that history, what's important to recognize and interpret. We're moving forward in that way in historic preservation. So I certainly commend your audience take a look at that report at civicmemory.la.
Yes, and then this will be another example of keeping Survey LA at the cutting edge of preservation nationally. So I think it'll be a great project. So why don't we shift a little bit? Sometimes preservation is seen as stopping progress. We tend to view it a different way. And so one of the big pressing areas for Los Angeles and really cities across the country is affordable housing. One of the things that were picked up in a variety of the surveys were projects that actually kept the historic building and built housing around it. Do you want to maybe talk about the 28th Street YMCA?
Yeah, sure. This is one of the projects I wanted in the book to highlight, as you said, these examples of how, again, it's not a choice between historic preservation and some of these other policy goals, such as housing, that really they can be reconciled, and that LA in many ways has shown the way. We have a number of successful examples all around the city about how historic preservation really can be part of the housing solution. So the 28th Street YMCA was a community center of great importance in South Los Angeles for decades, not too far from kind of the Central Avenue corridor that was such an important musical and jazz corridor in its heyday in the 30s and 40s. But this was really a true community center. Paul R. Williams, who I know Conservancy has been highlighting in recent programming, was the architect of this. This was from 1926. And then the building, began to, suffer from, less use, at least at the very least. And two nonprofits stepped in, purchased the complex, and collaborated about 10 years ago now to convert the historic building into 24 units of low-income housing, so dedicated affordable housing. But more than that, the project also shows how contemporary, but kind of highly differentiated, but compatible new development can be put behind a building like this and still work in a compatible way. And this is a kind of a more cutting edge design than some of the more contextual designs that could be provided for an addition. But Koenig Eisenberg Architects did this design with 25 additional units for low-income housing residents. And it shows how you can, and this is something that was reviewed by our Cultural Heritage Commission, by our Office of Historic Resources staff, and showing how historic buildings aren't frozen in time and that they can evolve and even accommodate new additions like this to meet contemporary needs.
Yeah, that's a great example of really using historic preservation to solve a current problem. So, so that's great. Thank you. The other area in terms of affordable housing that the Conservancy has been looking at, and actually is very tied to Survey LA, is bungalow courts, because they are naturally occurring affordable housing, and because they're protected by rent control, they remain affordable for, as long as the tenant lives there. And so Survey LA has been very helpful in identifying, where we have bungalow courts. And we have been having conversations with 2 different council members about trying to either designate them so they are protected, or find other ways to try and do this. So I don't know if you have any other thoughts about how we might be looking at keeping existing housing, because we can't build our way out of a housing crisis if we keep tearing down existing affordable housing.
No, exactly. This is an example of one of many bungalow courts that were identified in Survey LA. This one's on Martel Avenue in the Hollywood area, and one of the kind of 1920s Spanish colonial revival examples. And I think a number of bungalow courts were identified as significant through Survey LA. Some of them have been designated in recent years. We had a major preservation battle over one of them a few years back that did get designated. Ultimately, while it was proposed for demolition, a new buyer stepped in and rehabilitated that. But clearly, I think we do need probably a more comprehensive approach to the bungalow courts, and that may go beyond, again, we probably can't designate all of the structures in one fell swoop. And obviously there were a number of bungalow courts that weren't identified as eligible as well. So we may need to look at historic designation where that makes sense, or being able to designate non-contiguous sites that are scattered throughout the city through more of a kind of a thematic type of designation that some cities have looked at, or looking at zoning tools, other types of zoning incentives, perhaps, that would kind of encourage the reuse rather than the demolition and replacement of complexes like this.
Right. And I do think we need to look at a variety of ways. And, one of the things, we've talked a lot about in preservation is, the roots of preservation were very architectural. So we have tough integrity standards. And so one of the reasons that those bungalow courts weren't picked up by Survey LA, and I would say the majority of bungalow courts were not picked up by Survey LA, is because windows had been changed, even if it wasn't all the windows, or the windows were the major issue. Which really gets into, sort of, if we're thinking about preservation in a much more holistic way for communities, we need to be thinking about, does the bungalow court still provide affordable housing? Does it still contribute to the community? Does it create a place for people to live and really build their lives, and think about how we approach that perhaps differently? And that's something, certainly we're looking at the Conservancy, and would love to work with the city on for that, which actually leads us to our last topic, which is people-centered preservation. And I know that you had a couple of specific projects that you wanted to highlight.
Yeah, I did. The last chapter of the book is called "It Looking Ahead," really kind of looking at the future of preservation, and probably won't be able to cover all of that, but you'll have to read the book to get my take on a lot of those topics. But I did kind of end the book with a call to move toward what I call people-centered preservation, which is very much along the lines of what you just said, kind of going beyond the focus just on bricks and mortar work in preservation. So much of what we've focused on has been about the physical, but to also think about the people who inhabit these buildings and make them meaningful, their lived experience, the kind of the cultural practices, cultural traditions that some of these buildings reflect. And I think one example of that is Candela's guitars that we identify. One of the ways we've tried to get at that through the city programs in the city of Los Angeles has been through Survey LA, creating a series of preservation frameworks called historic context statements that really are meant to provide a framework for identifying and potentially designating sites based on their social or cultural significance. We've done a series of contexts related to ethnic and cultural history and themes in Los Angeles. One of those was the Latino Los Angeles context. And Candela's guitars was highlighted in that work and highlighted in the book. Really, again, a modest building architecturally. It's in the Boyle Heights community, but it opened in 1947, and for another one of these legacy businesses that for over 7 decades, not only has been an anchor for its community, but has been really a center musically and culturally for flamenco, classical, mariachi music, musicians in, mariachis in the Boyle Heights community, but also Arlo Guthrie or Jose Feliciano and others gravitated to this place. So it has really been a cultural and musical center, significant for all of those reasons that go so far beyond just the architecture and what would be obvious, in passing this site. So, kind of centering the people and the cultural practices in preservation is really crucial. And another example of that is the Mafundi building, or the Watts Happening Cultural Center in the Watts community that was has some architectural pedigree as well. Robert Kennard and Arthur Silvers, prominent African-American architects, designed this in the late 1960s. And this was kind of one of the first kind of cultural centers post 1965, after the unrest in Watts in 1965, and became a center for Black writers and poets and musicians. It's a building whose future has been somewhat in question recently. It's actually owned by the city, and the city's trying to determine how to move forward with this. We now have a historic cultural monument local landmark nomination that's pending for this site before our Cultural Heritage Commission. And you see here also the Watts Coffee House that was an important gathering place, had closed, now been kind of reopened, recreated. But another one of these sites that really speaks to kind of the people-centered preservation idea, and putting cultural practices and traditions alongside just the physical preservation of some of these buildings.
Well, I think that it's amazing that that this shift is occurring, and that it's actually been well received, and it says a lot about how we approach preservation in Los Angeles.
Yeah, it does. And I think just the last thing I want to show, talking about this subject, is I think we're trying to advance this work even further right now. And just last month, the city and the Getty announced an extension of its partnership on Survey LA through a project called the Los Angeles African-American Historic Places Project. And it is meant to, in part, rectify some significant disparities. And while the book kind of poses Los Angeles in many ways as a model for other cities through some of the projects that I've talked about here and others that are showcased in the book, we also recognize we have a long way to go in other ways. And I think the disparities that we have in terms of what is designated as a historic cultural monument is not something to be proud of in the city. That only about 3% of our historic cultural monuments, about 40 out of 1,200 plus, are associated with African American heritage, and it's about 6% for persons of color more generally. So this new African American Historic Places project is meant to provide some dedicated resources for historic designations of sites of African American heritage, like the other image shown here, New Temple Missionary Baptist Church, which was designated a couple of years ago as the site, for its significance, as the site where Aretha Franklin's Amazing Grace album, the highest selling gospel album of all time, was recorded, and the cultural significance associated with that. We want to do more of that in the city, but also this project is meant to look more critically at all of our preservation practices and processes through an anti-racist lens, and really looking at how are our processes creating equity or inequity, as the case may be today, and really taking a much more critical look at everything that we do.
Well, great. And the Conservancy certainly wants to work with you on that, because it is something that we are dealing with all of our programming and choices in terms of our programs and advocacy. So as always, there's much for us to work on. We have some questions. So we have a question from Terry, who wants to know, she just has submitted an HCM nomination. And during her search, she realized that there were very few cultural historic landscapes that have been designated, and wants to know, thoughts, any questions, and any answers you could give that would respond to that, Ken.
No, I think that's very true. I think that's another area where we do have a lot more work to do. I think this idea of a cultural landscape, really the intersection of, our built environment with both natural and designed landscapes, how those come together in this idea of a cultural landscape. That's in the length of our program, our historic cultural monument, cultural heritage ordinance goes back to 1962. It's a relatively newer idea in terms of really giving life to that. And I think it's fair to say that, we don't have many, it's true, we don't have many designated monuments that reflect the idea of cultural landscape. So I think that also speaks to also needing to engage those who have expertise in that area, landscape architects and other professionals and community members who think about public space and community space in that way. And to think about the types of partnerships we might engage in to encourage more work of that type.
Yeah, it's something the Conservancy has actually thought about, and that's part of the question too. Is the Conservancy trying to preserve more landscapes? And we will be looking at that. And I don't know if I'm supposed to say this, but our fall tour will be featuring Griffith Park. So we will have a major emphasis on the cultural landscape coming this fall.
Well, that's great. I will point out Griffith Park, we did designate as a historic cultural monument, although there were a lot of questions when we did that of just how large and sprawling it is. I think it may be the largest designated local landmark in the country in terms of acreage. I think it's about 4,000 acres, and again, a wide variety of great historic architecture, but also wide variety of designed and natural landscapes.
Yeah, so we're excited about that. But if I wasn't supposed to tell you, then don't tell anyone. So we have two questions that are similar. So I'm going to combine them, and it has to do with SB 9 and SB 10, and its impact on local historic zoning. And so, Ken, maybe you could talk about that, and then I'll talk about the Conservancy's advocacy. But the question is, with the threat that is out there because of SB 9 and 10, how is that affecting the city designating more HPOZs?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, SB 9, SB 10 are state bills that are pending that really are, kind of speaking to single family zoning and, enabling, kind of overriding local controls in that area, and would allow for multiple homes on single family properties, allow for lot splits. SB 10, I believe, is the one that would allow for rezoning of properties near transit as well. So this is part of a series of state bills, some of which have succeeded in recent years and been passed, some of which fell short in some of the recent sessions. And I do touch on this in the book as well, that this is a growing challenge, kind of the intersection of some of the state laws that are preempting local authority. Some of those, I think, unfortunately, are rooted, again, in some of the misperceptions I was referring to earlier, that historic preservation and those types of protections are inhibiting new housing development or new housing capacity. I have to say, I can't take a position on the bills in any way, because that's something that's up to our city council and mayor from the city level. But I think it's a growing challenge in that our historic preservation overlay zone program, as the questioner was referring to, has to kind of fit within this framework of new state laws. And some of the existing laws as well, such as the Housing Accountability Act that was passed a few years ago, some amendments to that law, really do require that projects, even in historic districts, be approved if they meet basic zoning requirements. And we can't apply some of our traditional kind of softer design guidelines in all cases now, and to shape those projects in the way that we might have previously. So there are a lot of questions about how our local historic preservation reviews will take place. In other cases, we do still have the ability to apply design reviews or to apply some of our demolition review processes, that projects would still have to go through those types of reviews in historic districts. But I think this is an area that we all need to be watching carefully. And in the book, I also do mention, and again, some in the preservation community may not agree with this, that the preservation community also needs to be open to sensible changes that do occur within some of our single family neighborhoods. And I think we've seen in many cases that some of the state laws, such as those on accessory dwelling units, which are second units or granny flats, that we've been able to see insertions of second units on single family properties, even in historic districts, that don't dramatically change the historic nature of those neighborhoods. And we have to be open to some of those provisions where it makes sense, but also make clear the benefits that historic preservation can bring, even in meeting housing challenges.
Right, and I think that's why, as preservationists, we're constantly looking at how do we use preservation to answer some of these problems.
Exactly.
And in terms of really looking at, when I made the point earlier about less than 7% of the city is historic, we really have to get that message out there, because there's still 93% of the city to build housing on, or to build more housing on. And the Conservancy this last year released our preservation positive report, which really looked at a lot of things that, when we found out that HPOZs are more economically diverse, racially diverse, have higher density than the city as a whole. So, the districts are not necessarily the problem.
Right.
But that's not widely believed. And so we really need to become, not cheerleaders, but really we have to be advocates to really change people's mind about that, because perception is, I think, one of the major problems here. But the Conservancy is working on this, believe me. And Adrian Scott Fine, our director of advocacy, is also on the board of the California Preservation Foundation, which is taking the lead, which is appropriate as a statewide organization. But we are on it, and we, if you follow our action alerts, we are often asking people to weigh in with their local representative. But this really is letting your local assemblyman and state senator know that this is not the way to increase the amount of housing, particularly because we have other options. So I would really encourage everybody to stay vigilant, as we are, and make sure that you are constantly saying that we have plenty of space to build more housing. And
Yeah, and I cite some of that preservation positive study in the book as well. And I think one of the most notable numbers is that the residential density in our historic districts is 50% higher than that in the rest of the city, and higher than several other major cities that people think of as highly dense communities.
And I will say that in California, we do have a state legislature that's trying to solve this problem, which is not typical across the country consistently. But cities throughout the country are facing this problem of the perception that we are stopping we're stopping the ability to build housing. So we need to be working hard on that. We have a fun question. So from an anonymous attendee that says, can you please discuss Ira Yellen and the work he did in downtown LA? Was he ahead of his time?
Great question. And actually, I do touch on Ira briefly in the downtown chapter of the book. And I think it's great to remember Ira and his role. I think he was ahead of his time in many ways. Ira took on the redevelopment, rehabilitation of the project I think he called it Grand Central Square, which included Grand Central Market, the $1 Million Theater, the Bradbury building across the street, and creating the Grand Central Apartments above the market. So one of the first downtown adaptive reuse projects for housing, portion of that was for affordable housing, as I recall. This was in the early to mid into the late 1990s, before the city's adaptive reuse ordinance and the kind of clearing away of some of the impediments to converting some of these buildings to housing. And the project initially was not terribly successful financially. He needed to go back to some of his governmental partners and get some additional funding to make that viable. But Ira really was a true visionary. He collaborated with Brenda Levin, who's also an important part of this book and the story. She is one of, along with Linda Dishman, 10 preservation profiles in the book that really are meant to spotlight some of the people whose commitment really have made preservation happen. So Linda and Brenda actually, I believe, are on facing pages of the book, and Brenda was an important part with Ira of that story downtown. And I think he was ahead of his time. He passed away far too young, and Adele, his wife, carried on a lot of his work. But it's good to remember his important role in this preservation story.
Yeah, I would really agree to that. And I remember I was fairly new at the Conservancy, so I think it was in the mid '90s actually that opened. And just walking in there and thinking this was the most amazing thing that he had done. And I think one of the things that I remember about Ira so much was just his consistent optimism in his beliefs, and getting back again at the power of persuasion. I mean, he really had the passion to convince people, in this case, government, coming into his projects and really supporting them. I think he was also ahead of his time in that he did the project. It was clear that it needed subsidy, and it was clear that future projects could not be done with subsidy. There wasn't that much money, and so that really led to the adaptive reuse ordinance, which really dramatically changed how these buildings were able to be brought back. But his knowledge of what the problems were to do that were critical in developing the adaptive reuse ordinance. So he was amazing in terms of being able to articulate that. So we have another question from one of our staff members, Rosalind Sagara, who would like to know more about the African American Historic Places Project, and will it extend beyond traditional preservation tools to address broader cultural preservation strategies with selected historically Black communities?
Yes, it will. So thank you, Rosalind. So as I touched upon, one part of the project is going to be to, we hope, rectify some of those disparities with respect to designated historic cultural monuments and advance nominations for sites that have been identified through our citywide African American context. That's one of those frameworks for historic preservation. That was completed in 2018. We want to broaden and deepen some of the work that was done on that context as well, and to do additional community engagement with historically African American communities across the city. So that will be part of the work as well. But yes, in addition to the traditional historic designation tools, we do anticipate developing broader cultural preservation strategies with approximately 3 historically African American neighborhoods. These will be very grassroots, kind of bottom-up efforts, collaborating with those communities to identify what are the approaches that really work for those particular communities. So in some cases, there may be some historic designations that are part of that. In other cases, it may be more of kind of an interpretive approach, or dealing with, as I was referring to earlier, kind of cultural traditions, what's often called cultural asset mapping, looking beyond buildings and looking at what are the broader cultural assets in a community, or looking at another concept from San Francisco called cultural districts, which are different from historic districts, but really are getting at some of those broader cultural traditions and practices in a neighborhood. So we've just launched the project. We will be going through a process of selecting a project leader to be retained by the Getty, but embedded within city planning and the Office of Historic Resources. But that will really be the person who, working with also some professional consultants, will help drive this work over the next 2 to 3 years. But again, with a very robust public participation component as well, and a project advisory committee that reflects community stakeholders from across Los Angeles.
Well, good. That sounds great. So We're going to end with a fun question, and I'm even going to answer it too. So, because like you, I have a similar background that I've worked both inside City Hall, although it was Pasadena City Hall, and outside. So, it's similar. So, you've done preservation both inside LA City Hall and outside as an advocate for the LA Conservancy. Which is more fun?
um, being an advocate for the Conservancy was more fun, I have to say. There's a certain kind of freedom and purity of being able to, be the advocate and to really articulate and advocate for something that you care about deeply, and to make the case before public entities or before the community at large. And what was also fun about doing it for the Conservancy specifically was the Conservancy is sort of a large extended family. That's how I always thought of it. It was not all, we had a one, but there was also, hundreds of volunteers and a larger community that we were part of. And kind of being part of the Conservancy family was always tremendously rewarding and fun. I have to say, we have a wonderful staff and a wonderful city family as well, but it's not always fun. It's different having to manage a program and run a program, and we kind of get it from all sides, if you will. And often we have to make decisions or administer the program in a way where we make everyone a little bit unhappy, whether it's preservation advocates or developers or property owners, and we kind of get buffeted from all sides. It's not always as fun as being a kind of a pure advocate, but it is I have to say, it's maybe more rewarding ultimately, and it's been very gratifying that we've been able to, through the city, implement a lot of what we were together advocating for at the Conservancy, and really create a full-fledged preservation program and complete a citywide survey and so many other things that we've highlighted in the book.
Yeah, I think I actually do agree with you in some of that. Um, it is fun to be an advocate, although heartbreaking. So yeah, that's the other side of that. I really enjoyed being in City Hall just because you can get things done, but you also were constrained in times. And for me, a real turning point in my advocacy. Well, my work in Pasadena was on the Huntington Hotel, which I felt was just a travesty. And I realized then I was on the wrong side of the issue because I was inside City Hall. So advocacy is for me is very much more fulfilling than being inside. But I also miss the ability to really have regulatory power. I mean, basically, the Conservancy's power is our people and our ability to persuade. And when you're inside City Hall, you can say this doesn't meet the Secretary of Interior standards, and you have power. So I think it's really interesting, and for all the people that are watching, this, I think that it's an interesting conundrum sometimes of would you rather have power versus persuasion. So but the persuasion really gets to the core of what we do, because you need persuasion inside City Hall too, because you need to persuade a lot of people inside City Hall that preservation is meaningful. So I will end with the power of persuasion is very strong in Ken's book. So I encourage you all. I know I've been seeing in some of the chat that people are buying it. There are all locations in the chat room to buy the book. If you would like it autographed by Ken, then you need to go to the Angel City Press. I have my copy here and it is autographed, so I recommend that. But thank you, Ken, so much for being here today. And you and I talk about these issues all the time, but we don't usually have 100 and some people.
This was great. Thank you for the opportunity, Linda. And this was fun. This was great.
And for all of you here, I just want to say thank you so much for being part of our group today, being the people of the people and places. You are the way that we are able to get so much done, as Ken pointed out, and we are incredibly grateful. For those that you are members, I want to say thank you, thank you, thank you. For those that are not members, I hope you'll consider becoming a member of the Conservancy. We would greatly appreciate that. And most of all, thank you for the work you do. We will be having another People Plus Places on May 27th that will be focused on the historic Tokyo Floors, which recently became a historic cultural monument. And we look forward to seeing you then. So thank you so much.